Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy. I'm a teacher and a tour guide here in Israel. This week, we are going to focus on a piece of news, the government expansion of the egalitarian prayer area at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Don't worry if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll explain. And then we'll talk about the Orthodox versus non-Orthodox split that is at the heart of this problem and what it means for the Jewish people. I'm not going to really be addressing the issue of religion and state in Israel in this episode, which is relevant, but it's just too big of a subject to get into in addition to what I am going to talk about, so we'll get to it in a future episode. We're also going to talk a bit about the Jewish calendar and the holidays that are going on this time of year. Now on with the show. Yesterday, my Facebook feed was flooded with articles and posts by people I know both for and against about the decision of the government to expand the egalitarian prayer area at the Western Wall. At first I was really confused. What was the big deal? After all, I go to the Western Wall, what we call the Kotel, all the time, and the egalitarian prayer area has been there for a couple of years. So what's the big deal with a government decision to expand it? Let's step back a bit more. After the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel reunited Jerusalem under its sovereignty, and Jews were able to access our holiest site again, the government immediately created a large plaza by the wall and handed it over to the nation's religious body representing Judaism, that is, the rabbinate, who turned it into an area with a separated men's and women's section at the front by the wall, which functions under the same rules as any Orthodox synagogue. That's because the Israeli rabbinate is Orthodox. That is to say that the state religion of Israel is Orthodox Judaism. The large open plaza farther back from the wall is used as a sort of entry gathering place and for national ceremonies such as the swearing in of soldiers. Since about the mid-70s, there's been a group of women who have been pushing for the ability of women to do everything a man does in the women's section of the Western Wall, in the style of the more liberal movements in Judaism. That includes public Torah readings and the wearing of tefillin, among other things. It's arguable that there's really no specific prohibition on either of these acts, though that's more complicated with the Torah reading, but they are clearly offensive to Orthodox sensibilities and arguably forbidden by Jewish law. Nonetheless, every month on Rosh Chodesh, that's our celebration of the New Hebrew month, the women of the wall would appear in the plaza doing what they do, which would create a scene and get them kicked out and occasionally arrested for disturbing the peace. Now, in 2013, Natan Sharansky, the famous Russian refusenik cum Israeli politician, that is, by the way, he failed as a politician because he was basically too honest, approached both the Women of the Wall leadership and the rabbi of the Western Wall to work out a compromise at the behest of the Israeli government. Now, I saw him at a conference shortly after that original compromise had been brokered, but before it had been implemented. He said he asked each side what they were not willing to compromise on. What was their red line? The rabbi of the wall, Rabbi Rabinovich, said he could not accept any diminution in the status of the Kotel Plaza as it stood, that is, according to his Orthodox standards. To allow that to happen would be a breach of his basic religious beliefs. The women of the wall insisted they had to have the ability to pray as their conscience dictates at the Western Wall. The compromise was to create an entirely new section of the Western Wall Plaza, separated from the existing section by an earthen ramp that goes up to the Temple Mount, just by about 50 feet, but along the continuation of the Western Wall, which the main plaza now, the plaza everyone's familiar with, is only a small part of the actual western retaining wall of the Temple Mount. Now, as I understand it from the time, in 2013, the Women of the Wall and the Rabbi of the Wall accepted this compromise, and Naftali Bennett pushed through the budget to build it right away. And it was built. And as far as I knew, and as far as I've been telling my tourists for the last few years, that was the end of it. But it turns out the government never officially recognized this decision in a vote or set aside a permanent budget to keep the place running. So apparently the legal battle for recognition of this egalitarian site and continuing funding has been going on ever since. Yesterday, the government passed the proposal and an as-yet incomplete budget to pay for it to expand and beautify the egalitarian section. Though nothing big will change on the ground, beyond a facelift for the existing section, it is a form of legal recognition for a non-Orthodox prayer space by the State of Israel. The Reform and conservative Jewish movements have decided this is a big victory, and they've started celebrating. Many Orthodox people are mourning in contrast. Now, I don't intend to get into the nitty-gritty of why the establishment doesn't like this or that practice, this particular practice. As I said before, the precise points of Jewish law are arguable even within an Orthodox framework. But it seems to me the main impetus for both the push to recognize liberal Jewish streams and the push against it are fueled by the animus the two sides have for each other in principle. That is not about a particular point of Jewish law, but about their general worldviews. Now, why is that? Why is there so much enmity between these different groups of Jews? After all, isn't it the same religion? Aren't we all Jews? Now, as I've alluded to in a few past episodes, notably the Who's a Jew episode, there are fundamental differences between Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism, with somewhat less dramatic but still fundamental differences between conservative and Orthodox Judaism. Now, today I want to talk specifically about the Reform movement, which is the larger of the two and probably the most relevant to this issue, in addition to being the easier one to address because the difference is more clear. A person looking down from the outside might think these are fights over minor differences, over exactly who can read from the Torah or who can wear tefillin and where and at what time. Basically arcane arguments over the minutiae of Jewish law, which, come on, we disagree over all the time, but it's sort of an academic debate. So what makes these differences the ones worth fighting over? But that's missing the forest for the trees. These specific disagreements are the results of completely divergent, or if not completely, largely divergent, and mutually exclusive worldviews, where the Orthodox view is that the Torah is literally true, and that legal authority was given to the rabbis to interpret it, and that interpretive tradition was passed down over thousands of years from Mount Sinai and is binding on every single Jew in a non-negotiable way, this is the fabric of the universe that does not depend on your thoughts or feelings about it kind of way. The Reform movement, in contrast, generally recognizes the Torah as being a document formed with, perhaps, divine inspiration, but by the hands of very flawed human beings. Therefore, though there is really no official Reform theology that I'm aware of that's binding, the general understanding seems to be that, to the degree something divine is found in our tradition, it is our job to separate it out from the chaff, that is, from the human foibles that form the rest. Therefore, the specifics of the Bible, and certainly the rabbinic tradition, is not binding. And in fact, Jewish law in general is optional, and only certain facets of it are even praiseworthy. For example, the Reform perspective on the Sabbath is that it's a day of rest, and they make of it what they will. They almost universally do not follow the Jewish law of Shabbat, but rather go to synagogue on Friday night to connect to their community and perhaps make a point to avoid working that day in a general sense. Perhaps they light Shabbat candles, perhaps they have a Shabbat meal, and of course all these things are optional, and people do the pieces of these rituals that speak to them. From an Orthodox perspective, that is nothing less than sacrilegious. The Bible, the direct word of God, specifically forbids all sorts of things on Shabbat that Reformed Jews do without a second thought. And our rabbinic tradition has interpreted that word of God down to the tiniest point of contention until this day. From that perspective, the Reform practice is not only sacrilegious, it abandons the main basis for Jewish life, experience, practice, and belief, both the divinity of the Torah and the binding nature of Jewish law. These are not secondary traits of traditional Judaism, but rather the central pillars. So when the Reform Jews look at us, the Orthodox, they see a group that chooses to do a lot more commandments than they do, some of them outdated in their opinion and even harmful, and who close-mindedly refuse to allow them to do their thing. And the Orthodox see a group of heretical Jews who reject the very foundations of Judaism, and therefore, even if their practice is only slightly different from the Orthodox norm, if it happens to work out that way in a specific case, it will be rejected with force as coming from a place of heresy and rejection of the foundations of the whole building. It's not seen as a legitimate source for change within Orthodox Judaism, even if some of that change might be legitimate within the Orthodox framework in itself if it comes from the inside. Now, the problem we have here is that we have two worldviews, one more inclusive and one more exclusive. The broader and more inclusive view will obviously have less trouble accepting the practices of others. But what infuriates me is the trouble they have understanding why that cannot be mutual. In other words, not as a matter of how a person feels about it, but as a matter of principle. Now, a Reformed Jew might respond that the Orthodox should change and be more inclusive, more broad-minded. But that would seem to either not understand or not care that this means abandoning the very foundational beliefs of our religion. The idea that it's okay to have groups of Jews not following Jewish law goes directly against the words of the Torah, which we Orthodox Jews take to be from God himself. As long as we believe that, no argument about unity, politics, or brotherhood, or anything else will move us away from that. Obviously, if you believe in an all-powerful God that created the world, what he asks you to do is going to come before any other consideration. Now, if I step back for a second and look at both of these perspectives from an outsider's place, I see benefits and problems with both views. But what I find frustrating is less the practical question of what to do and more the mutual unintelligibility of the two groups to each other. Many Orthodox Jews have a hard time believing that Reformed Jews are anything other than either ignorant or choosing to spit in the face of God and the rabbis. It's hard for people to give the benefit of the doubt that they might come to those conclusions honestly. And many Reformed Jews have trouble understanding the entirely different nature of Orthodox Judaism, which makes it not really analogous to their belief system, but just sort of a more stringent version, more stringent, less tolerant version of the religion they practice. But rather, it's a very different belief system on an entirely different theological and practical basis. And of course, also that people who believe in it can also be smart and come to those conclusions honestly. What I like about this compromise with the Western Wall is that neither side had their red lines crossed. Neither side is happy, but it seems that we can put this one boiling conflict between different types of Jews to rest for now. But as an Orthodox Jew and a rabbi in Israel, I am a bit bothered by the apparent recognition, the apparent legitimacy being granted to non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel. While I see Reformed Jews as Jews, part of the nation of Judaism, as I put it in the Who is a Jew episode, I see us as practicing fundamentally different religions, which both define themselves as Judaism, but are in fact much more different from one another than Protestants and Catholics, or Shia and Sunni. Now, are Protestants and Catholics members of the same faith? I don't know, but the theological and practical differences between Reform and Orthodox Judaism dwarf those that formed the Protestant-Catholic split. They never argued over the divinity of the Bible or of Jesus. It's only about the interpretation of what to do with that. They never argued whether the laws of the Bible, which they believe are relevant to Christians, were binding, only on what those laws were exactly and who had the power to interpret them, whether it was the Pope or each person for themselves. And I'm sorry to say that leaves us in a tough place. We are still, as of today, thank God, one big feuding and loving family, even when we're at each other's throats. That's because in addition to being a religion, Judaism, we are also a national group, or tribal or ethnic if you prefer, that has a long history and cultural affinity binding us together. In Israel, I think that national consciousness will be able to maintain us as one people indefinitely. But in the diaspora, I'm a little less sanguine about it. I'm a little less sure that non-Orthodox Jews who are assimilating at alarming rates are going to continue to be connected to the Jewish people indefinitely. I'm not so sure. I hope so. Perhaps with Israel as the center of the wheel, the spokes of peoplehood will sort of continue to reach out and hold the diaspora together despite our religious quarrels. Or perhaps that center will be so different from the largely assimilated communities around the world that it will become just another point of division, which is also a trend we've seen lately. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not even a historian, and I'm glad I'm not a person in power because I have no idea what to do about any of this. That's why I take the position of just explaining what's going on as I see it. But I am a Jew, and I pray that whatever our different views of God and Judaism, we will remain one people, one nation, forged in the fires of a 4,000-year history into a metal so strong that not even we can break it asunder. It's spring in Israel, or at least that's what the Jewish calendar would have us believe. Last week we celebrated Tu B'Shvat, that is the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Shvat, which is known as the birthday of the trees. In Israel, this usually is greeted with the dramatic burst of blossoming almond trees, with thousands of little blossoms turning the otherwise naked branches of trees into a cacophony of white flowers. But not this year. The Jewish calendar is a solar-lunar calendar. The secular, or Gregorian calendar, is a purely solar calendar, based on the Earth passing once around the sun and returning to the same place. Thus, the months should be in sync with the seasons. The Muslim calendar is purely lunar, with absolutely no connection to the Earth's travels around the sun or to the seasons. Therefore, the Muslim months move around relative to the Gregorian calendar and the seasons. Ramadan could happen this year in the summer, next year in the winter, the next year in the spring, etc. But the Jewish calendar, though based on the cycles of the moon, requires Passover to fall in the spring, because it's called the spring festival in the Torah. So the rabbis came up with a system for leap years, where we sometimes add an entire month to the calendar in order not to fall too far behind the solar cycle. That is, the cycle of the seasons. Thus, lunar-solar. It's basically a lunar system, but it's rigged so that it doesn't get too far out of sync with the solar cycle. This year is a leap year, a shana me'uberet in Hebrew, which translates as a pregnant year. Next month on the Hebrew calendar is going to be the leap month. So right now our calendar is running behind the solar year by about a month, and thus the early holiday for the trees, where they're blooming in the middle of January, or supposed to be blooming in the middle of January when it's snowing, instead of the middle of February when things are starting to warm up. But what that means is that spring in Israel starts in mid-February. So if you are looking to escape the cold and gray of a North American winter, you don't have to wait until the summer. Come in a few weeks. Check out my website at rabbieitan.com for information on tours with yours truly, articles, past episodes of this podcast, and of course for subscribe buttons for any platform. If you like the show, please go there and subscribe, share with friends, link to it on Facebook, go to iTunes and write a review, or just search for Jewish Geography on any of those platforms and it should come up. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I wish you health, happiness, and joy. Take care of each other out there.